Last season, the Clippers went 49-23, getting them the second seed in the Western Conference, only to blow a 3-1 lead in the playoffs in the second round to Denver. They blew a 3-1 lead, couldn't even fulfill the LA Western Conference fantasy that a lot of people had. But their top performers were Kawhi Leonard and Paul George and Lou Williams. Their more interesting players are, from last season, there aren't really many interesting players outside of their top performers. But diving into their top performers, Kawhi Leonard. We know him as one of the best two-way players in the entire league. Don't really need to say much. Great shot creator from all three levels. Improved as a facilitator. I would say much improved as a facilitator because he didn't really need to playmake in his Toronto days because Kyle Lowry was there, Fred VanVleet was there, Marc Gasol as a playmaking center was there. So Kawhi just had to focus on putting the ball in the hoop. But going to the Clippers with no real high-level playmaker, especially at the point guard position, playmaking was needed from everybody on that team, and Kawhi kind of fulfilled that. And on defense, he's a clamp artist on the perimeter. He's big enough to switch onto power forwards and some smaller centers, or centers that don't really have an elite post game. Kawhi is just one of the best two-way players in the league. Don't really need to say much about that. But I really want to talk about like off the court issues, or not issues, and not like really off the court, like going to the strip club or anything, but like leadership. We know Kawhi is a real quiet dude. He's pretty laid back, but also with that comes that he's not a very vocal leader. That's just speculation from outside and some confirmation from inside as well. Yeah, you're really not getting that like alpha dog leader, rally the troops type of guy in Kawhi Leonard that you might want in your best player on your team. And that kind of was the downfall in the playoffs. There was no real leadership in the locker room, giving Denver the chance to come back from a 3-1 lead and spark all of the Clippers memes over the summer. So maybe that will be more of a point of emphasis for him, or maybe the new coach, Tyronn Lue, will kind of inspire him to do so. Then free agency is another thing to talk about. With Paul George extending for 5 years, does that make it more likely for Kawhi to stay, or does that make it more likely for him to go? It really depends on how well PG plays this season, and especially in the playoffs. But if his first game against the Lakers were anything to kind of indicate anything, if he's going to play at that level, Kawhi would definitely stay. Because he wanted to go to LA. Even when he was traded from the Spurs, he wanted to go to LA. So I think for that simple reason, he's going to want to stay. But playoff P, way off P, pandemic P, backboard George. Oh, I gotta stop. Paul George is still a great shot creator. Like, memes aside and everything, like, PG is still a great shot creator. A lot of his shots came from three-point land. 48.7% of his field goal attempts were from three-point land. And yes, Paul George is a great off-ball scorer that can come off of pin downs, floppy sets, and catch the ball off of a pass and shoot it from downtown. But a lot of those three-point attempts came from him just initiating offense out of the ISO, hitting a step back or side step three, or out of the wing pick and roll, coming off the screen, getting the defender behind him and pulling up. He was hitting a lot of tough three-point shot attempts, and he was taking a lot of them. So his efficiency from three-point land was really great over the regular season. But his field goal percentage kind of suffered mainly because his efficiency from the twos were down. Mainly from the mid-range. He did not shoot great from mid-range last season. But we also have to talk about the playoff collapse. It was bad. He blamed a lot of it on Doc Rivers kind of misusing him. He also blamed some of it on mental issues from him being in the bubble. I mean, it doesn't really excuse the fact that he was bad. If he can be at least 80% of himself from the regular season, the Clippers can definitely be real like championship contenders. But if he can't be at least 80% of himself, there's no way that they can really contend for a championship. And I don't think Kawhi can carry that team if PG isn't at least 80% of himself. Off that playoff collapse and off him firing shots at Doc Rivers, he's got a lot of shit to prove this coming season. We also got to talk about this big ass extension. It's a lot of money. I don't think we can argue that. It's really a lot of money, especially after what we've seen from PG in the bubble. But the Clippers had to bring him back at all costs, because you got to consider the amount of picks they gave up to get him, and you can't really risk losing Kawhi and him in free agency, because that would be an absolute doomsday scenario. So they had to do everything in their power to get him back, And if giving him, what, $40 million a year over the next 5 years was what it required, then I don't really blame them. With him being there for the next 5 years, it guarantees that the Clippers will always be in the playoff hunt if they were to lose Kawhi. And maybe him signing an extension makes it more likely that Kawhi will stay. Lou Williams, good scorer off the bench, still. One of the best of all time. Six Man Like Lou Will, one of my favorite songs by Drake. Really great scorer, mainly on-ball scoring. He's improved a bit as a catch-and-shoot guy, especially with playing off of PG and Kawhi last season. But he's always been a great on-ball scorer, especially in the pick and roll, getting some floaters, getting to the rim, drawing contact, hitting threes off the pick and roll. He's always been a good all-around scorer. But he is a tad bit inefficient. He's always been that. But that comes a lot with a player that has the type of play style that Lou Will instills. He's a bad defender. He's an absolute liability on defense. He improved a bit last season. I think he competed a bit more on that end than he has in the past, but he still is a defensive liability just because he's real small, man. He's like 6'1", 170 out there. Yeah, and he's getting older. So hopefully his defense doesn't take too much of a slide, and hopefully he's still like as good of a scorer as we've all seen, because it is pretty fun to watch when we see Lou Will start cooking it up. In the offseason, the Clippers had a pretty noisy offseason. A lot because of people that left, but also a lot because of people that they brought in. They made a trade to bring in Luke Kennard for Shamet, basically. It was a 3-team trade, but that's what they gave up and that's what they got. Bringing in Kennard, who's, I would say, is a good shooter, or as good of a shooter as Landry Shamet was. Well, Landry Shamet was horrible in the playoffs, but Kennard is as good or maybe even better of a shooter than Shamet, but he's a much better playmaker, and this Clippers team needed playmaking. In no way is Kennard an elite level playmaker, but he's somebody that can definitely facilitate in the second unit. In the draft, they got Daniel Oturu. My bad for saying that Minnesota drafted him. There was just so many 3-team trades in the 2020 draft that really confused me. But yeah, my bad. That was incorrect information. Don't know much about him. I don't think he's going to get that many minutes. But in free agency, Montrezl Harrell left. It looked like an L for the Clippers because they were losing him for nothing. But then they come out here and get Serge Ibaka on a 2-year, $19 million contract, who many would argue would be a better fit than Montrez. He doesn't really have much like on-ball necessity. Like, he doesn't really need the ball in his hands to be effective as much as Montrez needs the ball in his hands to be effective. He's a floor spacer, something that Montrezl Harrell wasn't, and he's a much better defender. And I think at times, so those are some upgrades there. We'll have to see though if it is a great fit. A lot of people are overreacting and saying it is a definite better fit, but hey, we don't know. We gotta see it over an 72 game season. And then they made some sneaky pickups, or a sneaky pickup, in bringing in Nicholas Batum, who a lot of people forgot about, but he was a great playmaking forward in his Portland days when he was playing with a younger Dame, Wesley Matthews, LaMarcus Aldridge, of course. I don't know who their center was, but Nicholas Batum was that 3-and-D playmaking small forward, and he showed some good amount of minutes against the Lakers in that first game. We just forgot about him because he went to Charlotte, and that happens to a lot of people when they go to Charlotte, but looks like a good pickup for them. Hopefully he hits threes. That's kind of the main question mark, if he can be a consistent three-point shooter for them, but hey, I think it's a good signing, especially given that it was a minimum signing. They also re-signed Marcus Morris on a 4-year, $64 million contract. I think it's a bit of an overpay in my opinion, but I don't know. And they also brought back Reggie Jackson on a 1-year minimum contract. Looking at this depth chart, I think it has a good chance of being a better like 10 or 11 man rotation than last year's 10 or 11 man rotation. Yes, you do lose the 6th man of the year, but you bring in somebody who might be a better fit for you and your team. You retain the rest of your core players, and you bring in Luke Kennard and Nicholas Batum, who address the hole in your team's game, which is playmaking. So for those reasons, it might be a better lineup, better 10 or 11 man rotation than last year. And coaching them is Ty Lue, who was the assistant coach last year, head coach of that 2016 championship winning Cavs team. He was the head coach, technically. I know LeBron was there, but he was the head coach. And we'll see if the issues that PG alluded to with Doc Rivers are gone with Ty Lue as the head coach now. I project the Clippers to go 50-22, and I think they're going to get the second seed in the West again. I was really bouncing between them, the Nuggets, and the Mavs, between that second seed in the Western Conference, and ultimately I took the easy route, I know, in saying that the Clippers would get the 2 seed, and I think they're going to make the Western Conference Finals this year. The pressure is on for everybody in that organization to really finally at least make the Western Conference Finals and stop getting bounced in the fucking second round. And I think Kawhi and them are going to respond, and I think they're going to move farther than the second round this year, but I think my Lakers are going to eliminate them. Maybe it's a bit biased for me, but hey, that's my prediction. And then obviously this team is contending. They got two of the best two-way shot creating wings in the league, and maybe they got better with, you know, the playmaking additions and Ibaka maybe being a better fit. Even with their collapse in last postseason, the Clippers must be hungry to redeem themselves. The offseason was filled with 3-1 memes and pandemic P-jabs. It's basically been a 2-month-long Clippers roast session. Jokes aside, they're still in great position to bring home a championship in 2021. They still have one of the league's best dynamic duos in Kawhi and PG. They still have one of the league's best bench scorers in Lemon Pepper Lou. Sure, they lost the 6th man of the year, but they replaced him with Serge Ibaka, who you can argue better fits this team. As much as it pains me to say this, the Clippers are still one of the top contenders in the league, and the most likely team out west to knock off my Lakers from their pedestal.